Woman, a program by, for, and about women today, with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening. Tonight, a legislative update. With me is Carol Burris, President and founder of Women's Lobby Incorporated, a Washington-based organization that works for the passage of legislation concerning women. Also here is Susan Tannenbaum. Susan is editor and founder of Women's Washington Representative, a newsletter on federal actions that affect women. Susan is a lobbyist and a former congressional assistant investigating women's issues. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Since you both work very closely with Congress, one of the things that people say to me, Carol has been on several times before, Susan, and one of the things people say to me is, why don't you ask her what is Congress like? So, what is Congress like?
Well, Congress is collection of men. I think if you looked around any room, your local PTA or any collection of human beings that was mostly men, mostly white men, mostly comfortably off white men, that's quite a bit what Congress is like. You can't expect them really to be much more sensitive to women's problems, say in pregnancy or poverty or some of the things that women uniquely face, than any group in Tuckahoe or Reno.
Well, as well, they're insulated by several layers of privilege and prestige, so that what Congress can do with a lot of money for secretaries and a lot of money for staff is pretend that that's the real world. And so when you're discussing how Congress behaves, I think you have two real points. One is that they're always 10 years behind the times because they're very insulated from things. And the second is that they consider their life experience, which is putting themselves on the line for possible public failure, running for office, someone loses and someone wins. And so they have the chance of having their name appear as a headline that they won or as a headline that they lost. And in fact, most members of Congress lost one time, ran again, and then won. And so they feel very strongly that they have dared and suffered far more than any but their peers will ever understand. And so the problems of, say, low-income women, or the difficulties that women have in getting and keeping decent jobs, don't seem as real to them as this life and death struggle with the electorate every 2 years or every 6 years.
I think that's a good point, that this struggle itself insulates them, their affluence, their relative affluence insulates them still further, so that when you come around and you say, Congressman, do you realize the problems of a woman with 3 children living on a welfare check of $140 a month? You don't get any response. You get a kind of a glazed look, because even I have a difficult time imagining what it's like living on $140 a month, one woman, let alone with 3 children, and someone who's relatively more insulated than I.
Whose new raise will bring them to $60,000 a year.
And has a hard time living on that.
Yes.
Has an even more difficult time comprehending, let alone empathizing or working on legislation. I mean, it's just so much easier to work on
energy.
Good. The oil shortage.
The current sexy issue. What shall we do about energy?
Than it is to work on it, to even comprehend what it's like to
All right,
live.
well, this presents special problems to both of you, obviously. So, I mean, what do you do to get through this insulation?
Well, I started my lobbying career looking for senators to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment and found a back stairway in the Capitol that leads to the only men's room off the Senate floor, and waiting for them, having discovered that a senator just in the process of finishing zipping his zipper is much more vulnerable than other people. I think that there are lots of other ways that you can try and parlay the access we have as middle-class, educated women who have an interest in politics into a level of access to them I also think that one of the problems with constituent pressure is that we as women don't always think that we're worth it, and so we tend to temper our judgment of these men by saying that he's good on this issue or good on that issue, and the only issue he's bad on is one of our issues, abortion or family planning services or poverty issues. And the other thing that I think that we have to really realize is that while the people who have access to that man are also men, there are mistresses, there are daughters and wives and secretaries, and that obviously all of those people who have access are people who are potential fifth column to join us.
Right. But clearly we're still working as a fifth column. It's not like we can call up the local bank president, who is the congressman's banker, and say, look, will you tell him about this piece of legislation on credit? We really have to work through such fifth column methods as mistresses, or really I kind of laugh when I hear Carol talking about getting these guys with as they zip up, but it's particularly on some of the more difficult issues that we work on, the issues that they're more likely to think of as talking dirty, abortion, family planning, issues that we're not...
Teenage pregnancy.
Teenage pregnancy. We're not likely to be able to call up and say, I'm president of Women's Lobby, I'm the editor of Women's Representative, may we come and talk to you about family planning? The minute they hear family planning, they're likely to say, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm busy. The best way to get them is to corner them in the hall, to run after them. Senator, Senator, you know, may I speak to you for a minute? The best technique is the handshake. Senator.
Yes.
Now that, and then when you have them by the hand, not to let them go until at least you're
You mean
halfway
you really
in.
do things like that?
Of course. Every politician shakes so many hands that if he sees someone with their hand outstretched, he shakes it. So that if you have either a poor memory for faces, in which case you're not going to get far lobbying, but if you have a good memory for faces, but there are new members coming in, you go up to a whole range of well-dressed white men and say, how do you do, Congressman? And all of the congressmen will take your hand and say, hi, haven't seen you in a while, good to see you, even if they've never laid eyes on you before in their entire life.
It's true, and this gives you your entree.
You then, let me demonstrate the lobbyist handshake, grab them by the elbow, because no one wants their $300 suit left in the palm of your hand. And so if you're going to talk a difficult issue in which you desperately need a vote, you make sure that you have a method for making sure that he's going to be there with you, and not say, oh, thank you very much, and exit. And so there has to be a little arm twisting. But that's all right. Senators and congressmen then grab you. There's one senator who drinks far too much, who tends to lean on your shoulder in slightly drunken stupor and massage your upper arm. And another senator, quite well known, who has the 13-year-old carry, which is that you grab like this so that with the tips of your fingers you can ripple the nipple while you're sitting and talking.
This is all very disillusioning, I have to admit.
Well, it would be much easier, much simpler not to have to rely on these methods. And I think if we worked only on energy issues, we would be able to gain entree even as women without having to rely on these tactics. But the more difficult your issue becomes, the less respectable your issue becomes, the more you have to invent ways.
Generate access as a
Well,
means to
what
beginning
occurs to me as you're
discuss it.
talking is that I know you both work, very hard and very long hours, and I'm wondering what sort of interest and support do you get from other women? What do you think most women want to know? How much do they want to know? How involved do people want to be? I know you gave a talk at a law school recently.
I think that women don't want to know a lot about the mechanisms of Congress, and I can never figure out whether that's because they're complicated, they're not difficult, they're just complicated, or whether it's because we have this sense that it's something that we're not going to understand. And I can't mesh that quite with the fact that most liberal Democrats in the House and Senate also don't want to know anything about the House rules. And it may just be that a sensitivity to issues leads you to think that the process is not as interesting. But what women do want to know a lot about is the question of the issues and how they affect them, and also how the people who are in their city, that it is an unfailing question and an unfailing crowd pleaser to say, and your two senators so-and-so are just terrible, or this one is very good and that one is very bad, and your Congress people, so that they want to know something in which they feel that they can have sort of a level of competence. And that one difficulty of the kind of lobbying that we do, and the kind that you can do on the state level, is it must be done at the Capitol. That's the only place where you're going to get enough gossip and have enough information to be able to move on things quickly enough. And I'm sure that in your local paper, as in all the local papers when I go around the country, there tends to be just a brief mention of an issue after it's passed the Congress and is already going to hit you in the head, rather than a discussion of the hearings or places at which there's a space for public input. That means that people are very much the victim of that little half hour on the television news and the little spaces in their local paper to cover that level of issue.
I guess my question is, why aren't you turned off? Why aren't you so disgusted you throw up your arms and go home?
Oh, it's so interesting. It's hard to explain to people. One of the things we try to do in the newsletter is carry a certain amount of, if not the gossip, at least some of the machinations that go on behind the scenes, some of the real prejudices that move people. But it's, in microcosm, it's a little gossip column. Although the issues that we may work on, you know, they have facts behind them. I can tell you that 35% of women hold public service jobs and so on. What's really happening is that fewer women hold them than Vietnam veterans, or that, you know, you see the weights of the prejudices at work, and the people's personalities, their passions, really kind of emerge in very measured tones through what they do. It's a fascinating thing to watch, to see what really moves people a little closer to the surface than many occupations.
You get a feel for this if you get the congressional record. Just have your congressman send you a copy, any day's copy. It's the world's greatest joke book, and when you realize that they have already edited that because they have access to the record each day and can edit it for the next morning's publication, and that this is what they think you should be reading to present a good picture of themselves, give you some sense of sort of how their feeling is, because they know that most people will not read it. And what I find is that not only is it really fun and tremendously satisfying to really make sure that someone votes your way even though they hate your guts, it's also an enormous sort of influence thing. When we passed minimum wage for domestics, we were able to influence the lives of 2 million women whose average income was less than $2,000 a year, and we doubled it essentially with one stroke of the pen, and that kind of broad-based influence. And so there are two categories of legislation, you know, the question of the large number of women you can affect in this way, and the question of sins of omission, places where they're going to hurt you if you don't stop them. And a lot of effort is put into really bad amendments so that they never see the light of day. And there are just a wide range of activities in which you're sort of sewing up little trades to make sure that everybody's very happy so that nothing will get done.
One of the answers to that question is that if we give up and discuss, who's going to watch what happens to us, you know, in tomorrow? I mean, not that others won't come and take our place, but you also have this sense of being a little tiny fist in the dike, and that and really that it's important work, that it's necessary work, without which something worse might happen.
There's a new administration now and a new feeling, and how has this changed things? I mean, what are some of the Carter proposals? How do they affect women?
Well, I think that the first thing you have to say about the Carter administration in Washington is that they've changed the level of debate for the kinds of women's issues that we're going to talk about. One is that under Ford and Nixon, you spend an enormous amount of time gaining access to individual policymakers. Carter has given women that access for whatever reason. He hasn't employed women in those jobs, but he's given you access to the men that he did employ. And so you're now seeing them in their shining mediocrity. And you have a way of commenting to their face on shining mediocrity. I don't know how satisfying that ever is. But the proposal that I'm really interested in is the economic stimulus proposal, and the whole question of how they're going to do something about this. And
all right, explain what it is first.
Basically, the proposal gives a $50 refund to every taxpayer under $25,000 a year, and that is to every person, so that you will get them for your children as well as for husband and wife. And it provides then for a one-shot sort of jump in the economy in the hope that people will spend this money. It also provides for a level of incentive for businesses that is a much higher dollar cost than the level of incentive for the average taxpayer. And businesses are allowed to take a choice between a 2% investment tax credit added to the 10% they already have and 4% refundable tax credit on their Social Security taxes. Employers and employees now pay 5.585%, and the businessman would then get back 4% of that in a refundable tax credit. And that's really nefarious. It is rewarding every one of those corporations that have for years discriminated against women and minorities. And at a time when many people are questioning the problems of the Social Security system because it's a direct tax on payroll, which is a regressive system of taxation, and the poor pay much more than the rich, because the question of a large sort of baby boom group of people becoming 65 when others would then have to raise their taxes to pay into the system, and also because the question of how we intend to pay those benefits out. And that's very important to us as women. 2/3 of the people over 65 are women. They live on less than $2,000 a year, and 14% of them have no income whatsoever. And to then allow businesses not to pay their share toward these elderly women's incomes and refund it to them. I don't want to give them the money unless they sign a little pledge saying, and with this money we will do affirmative action. Half of all the jobs that are created would go to women. And I think that they're not signing up, and so I'm not very anxious to have my tax money. We have to remember in all these economic stimulus questions that women pay an inordinate share of taxes. Because we are lower income workers, our tax money is deducted before we ever see it, whereas if you're in an upper bracket, you can file quarterly and you have a chance for the use of that money during the quarter, and as well an additional system of deductions to allow you to keep more of it over the long term. Secondly, the income splitting proposals, and Carter is proposing now $2,100 for single people and $3,000 for married couples, having figured out after a question that an HEW employee asked him that although he doesn't want people to live in sin, that it's more rewarding tax-wise to do that. He is now talking about his deduction as if income splitting were not the major problem, and there's a huge marriage penalty in taxes, and it falls very heavily on those of us who are married women who work, because there is no way that a man who makes $30,000 a year can afford not to have a wife and not to have a very poor wife. And the reason is that he needs to split that $30,000 with a low-income person that he's married to. And so there's a large disincentive for paying all of us what we're worth. And equal pay is not going to be really solved as a problem until we pay only our fair share of taxes and not the additional taxes of a high-income person that we're living with. And I think that Carter has not understood this at all. And then here we are paying out, and we're going to pay out essentially to businesses that have never hired us in the past. And I'm not at all sure then that there's any reward. That tax proposal was never thought up with women in mind. We were totally forgotten. The second part of the economic stimulus proposal, which you really should talk about, is the question of the jobs. The public works section of the jobs is going to have $6 billion or $4 billion, depending on how they work it out, whereas public service is going to be funded at something like $300 million.
Yes, so talk about that, because that's interesting.
The public works jobs are primarily construction jobs, and not only, it's really impossible to figure out how many women get these public works or have gotten them in the past, because figures aren't kept, but we called the administration that runs these public works programs, and they said, well, generally the beneficiaries are primarily males, they said to us, and they are. Well, the administration is now talking about having $4 or $6 billion extra in expenditures for these public works construction jobs, which will go primarily to males. And Carol went in the other day to talk to a very key person, pointing out that it's really very important.
Who did you talk to, Carol?
I talked to the counsel for the subcommittee. Robert Rowe is the chairman of the subcommittee. He's from New Jersey. And we talked to his counsel, who said, well, you have this all wrong. There is no discrimination in the Public Works Jobs Bill. That is a bill aimed at jobs in the construction industry. And there are no women and minorities in the construction industry, so obviously there's no discrimination.
And it doesn't seem to occur to them that if they put in an apprenticeship training program, or if they really were striving to bring women into these programs, this is a marvelous opportunity. Here, Congress is trying to double the amount of money that even Carter wants to spend on these jobs. Why, half of it could go to whoever they wanted to go to begin with, to the construction industry, and another half could go to bringing women into the industry, and yet it hasn't occurred to them. Now, back in the late 60s, there was a federal effort to bring blacks into the construction industry through something called the hometown plans. And while the figures aren't final on these programs, between 68 and 72, the number of minorities who went into apprenticeship programs under federal construction contracts jumped from at least 6,000 to at least 13,000, according to their figures. And during that same period of time, the number of women jumped from 12 women to 15 women under the same apprenticeship program. If the same effort were made now, perhaps we could leap from 15 women
To 17.
17, 150,
15,000.
some great, but it's not thought of. It's such a, we began by talking about the makeup of Congress and their limitations as privileged men, and it wouldn't occur to them, although I think the claim of blacks and Vietnam veterans, and certainly unemployed construction workers, means something to them, at least as a political force. The claims of women as potential construction workers hasn't occurred to them yet.
Are these the two most important things to watch, the economic stimulus plan and the job plan, or is there something else?
That's the current level of what Congress is dealing with, and they're trying to get the bills passed very quickly. They're moving through committee at what is for Congress unseemly haste, matters of weeks instead of years. And I think that we're going to be hearing a lot about them because they are Carter's central plan for putting the economy on the track. And a central plan that leaves out 51% of the population obviously leaves something to be desired. The other major thrust of the administration is to work out a plan for welfare. And as we've discussed before, 97% of the people who are on welfare are those 3 million women taking care of 8 million children. However, in the group, this sort of staff group that Califano set up under Henry Aaron's direction to work on welfare, there is not a single black person, and there is no woman who is on welfare. And the sole minority woman, Arabella Martinez, even acknowledged that she felt odd and lonely being there. Most of the people who are on the little task force are white men, and there are 5 women. And I think that the level of the discussion that they have is best shown by the working paper that they have. There are 70 million men 70,000 men on welfare, as opposed to these 3 million women and 8 million children. And the sole example that they give of welfare dependency is of a man with a wife and 2 children. And we turn to page 2 to see the next example, and then to page 3, and there are no other examples. And in discussing the general thrust of welfare legislation, the administration is talking about creating jobs for those people who are employable who are on welfare. Well, if all you're going to create are construction jobs, where are these women going to go? Mm-hmm. And that these two policies obviously have to mesh, because if you're not going to be on welfare, you have to have enough money to support yourself. The best way for a non-skilled person is to move into those apprenticeship jobs which pay well immediately and require little bits of training. And the other thing is that there's no discussion of daycare. And if you are at home...
Well, but the Vice President is particularly interested in daycare, is he not?
Yes. He's not on the task force.
Oh, he's not?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think the question of what we can do about making it clear that those women are working in the home taking care of children, and you're going to have to replace that service if you want them to work for money outside the home, is something that we haven't made clear to Califano at all.
But we only have about 3 minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court, and I want to talk a little bit about the cabinet appointees. But let's talk about the Supreme Court for a minute. What is your reading on what's been happening lately? Especially the pregnancy thing.
I guess I see in the Supreme Court the same thing that I began talking about the Congress. You have white, comfortable men who, in the Supreme Court case, can't even seem to distinguish the fact that women because they get pregnant, are kind of uniquely discriminated against. They seem to see pregnancy and sex discrimination as very separate issues, which just absolutely boggles my mind. And how they cannot kind of rise to this realization is beyond me. It's a measure, I think, of their...
As Rehnquist says, this is not discrimination on the basis of sex. Any pregnant person, regardless of sex, would not get disability pay. And I want to talk a little bit particularly about Califano. I think Juanita Krebs will be excellent.
No, don't wait a second. You have to identify Califano.
Califano is the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, a former Johnson appointee, who is now cutting off all federal money for abortion. He and Carter have agreed that that is their plan, and as well as running a department in which he takes into account most of our central issues, the question of education, all of welfare, the whole question of health and what we're going to do about maternal and infant health and what we're going to do about all of those early preventive screening programs, and who is peculiarly insensitive to the idea of what women are going to do with their lives, and someone who really believes that things were good under Johnson, when, as we all know, there was no women's movement. It wasn't good for us, and we weren't really being heard. And I think he's probably, besides people like Griffin Bell, one of the very worst people who could be appointed to such a
You
very
both
sensitive
picketed
job.
him, did you not?
Yes.
Yes, we had kind of went back to our earlier tactics. It was impossible to get in to see him. Here's a man who's saying that not only does he oppose abortion morally, but he will testify against its inclusion in any national health insurance program. A man, you know, who just cannot distinguish between his personal beliefs and what he wants to impose on American women. And yet he wouldn't be heard. There was no way to get into him and talk to him in a reasonable manner, as I'm sure we would rather do than picket, because it's cold picket. I mean, it may be fun to picket. We see each other and we walk around and get a lot of attention. But actually it's hard to picket. I'd much rather go in and sit down and talk to Califano and be able to give him figures, how maternal mortality has, you know, dropped.
How did he, we have 30 seconds, how did he respond to your picketing?
He responded by telling people, we have this from sources at the White House, including Carter, that there were some crazy women picketing him, and when job applicants came in, he said, this is a very difficult job, there are some women out there picketing us. And evidently it really got under his skin. He likes to be loved. Everybody likes to be loved.
We're out of time. I thank you both very much. For more information, you might want to write to one of the following. Good night.
This program was produced by WNED-TV, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding was provided by public television stations. Additional support was provided by unrestricted general program grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation.